book of Job. Please mute your audio during the presentations. The name Job has been mentioned more than usual during the last year. Let's look back at the material. First, Rabbi Kaplan will reintroduce Job to us, followed by Bill Schulman, Carol Eberlein, and Ralph Hallberg, each with different views. After their presentations, we want you to share your thoughts or ask questions. Please raise your hand using hand raise in the Zoom program or just at the bottom of the screen, or just wave so someone can see you. Remember, please, to unmute yourself after the presentation. Before we begin, I want to thank each of our presenters for taking the time to participate in this Adult Education Committee program. Rabbi Kaplan, please begin with your introduction.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Diane. And once again, thank you for allowing me to be part of this, inviting me to be part of this. This is wonderful. It's an incredible subject. There's no question about it. I'm sharing my screen right now. And can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the book of Job, or Sefer Iyov, it's an interesting, it's a part of a collection. So I don't know if you realize that, especially in the book of the books of Ketuvim, the writings, a number of them are grouped together in styles, as it were. There are several books that form a group of poetry, and it's actually Sifrei Emet. It's sort of the backwards of Job and Proverbs and Psalms, but in Hebrew format. So those three books usually form part of the books that are referred to within poetry. Sometimes the biblical scholars and some rabbis will add also Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon into that as well. Now we come in now. There's also another group called the wisdom literature. Now, Job very much fits within the style of the poetry, because most of it is in a poetic format. But the material within it is presented in such a fashion as to teach wisdom literature, wisdom morals, and that kind of a thing, which is what it's all about. And it fits part of the group with Job, with Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, parts of Daniel, and even some parts of the Psalm. Now we get into who wrote the book of Job. Now remember, even when you have like the book of Jeremiah, very few of the prophets actually wrote their own books. They had students, as it were, who were a part of their followers, and they would actually write. We know that for Jeremiah, it was some individual named Baruch who actually penned Jeremiah, the book, for us. In some instances, like with King Solomon, someone wrote a book, but to give it authority, they attributed it to King Solomon. And we have the same thing. So you have Book of Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes are generally attributed to King Solomon. Some of the Psalms are, and you wind up, and some rabbis even consider that from the Talmud felt that perhaps King Solomon wrote Job as well. We get into, now I know I'm on a time frame, so I'm gonna try to respect that. The name of Job, Eva, can come from one perspective, the Hebrew word to be hostile or to suffer hostilities. That certainly ties in with the book itself. Still trying to track that down, one look is at the early Semitic form of this in a cuneiform form. It comes from, like in the Hebrew, Ayeka, where are you? So this one, Av, where is the divine Father? Job is calling out, where is God in all of this? And so there are various kinds of trying to put this into perspective. What is the book of Job all about? And that's what I'm trying to do now. I just want to lay the groundwork. So is Job fact or fiction? And that actually is an interesting discussion. One of the discussions in the Talmud itself is whether it's fact or fiction. One of them included within that was who wrote the book of Job. Some Talmudic rabbis said it must have been Moses and it was written during that time. Others said during the time of King Solomon, and others said during that Job himself wrote it whenever that happened to be, and that it was fact, not fiction. It's in the third book of the Ketuvim, the writing sections that I mentioned. It was never challenged. There were other books that were challenged by the rabbis as to whether they should be included ultimately in the formal canonization of the Tanakh. But Job was not included, was not part of that. There was no question. Esther was challenged as to whether, because Esther doesn't mention the name of God, so they had to decide, well, is that a book that should be in there? The book of Maccabees, they was decided they would not be included in the canon for other reasons. But so that comes in. The style of Job is very much written along the style of the Greek tragedies of that time period. And so that kind of pulls us into it a little bit there. The next, some of those who are writing, I mentioned about the Talmud, but also Talmudic rabbis, but also biblical scholars, so that perhaps that Moses wrote. This is one rabbi said it was Moses who wrote it, which meant that from the way the story was being unfolding, that Job was an advisor to Pharaoh, and though he was righteous and good and didn't challenge God, since Job didn't stand up to Pharaoh to protect the Jewish people, he just remained quiet, that actually was the reason for what he went through. And so it's kind of iffy, but that's still from one rabbinic perspective of that time, early Talmud time period, that was that. Others put it, like I said, the time of King Solomon. And others say that it was even perhaps during the time of the either as late as the Babylonian exile or later, and would have put Job as a contemporary of Esther with the book of Esther. Whether Job existed or not, we do know from the book of Ezekiel, who lived and preached during the 6th century before the Common Era. Ezekiel mentions Job along with Noah and Daniel as two figures of historical importance. Well, we'll get into that. I will say the story, I'm gonna stop sharing now. So the story, as many of you already know, is one in which, as one source says, the story of Job is very simple. It is a conversation between God and one of his loyal angels called Satan. We can get into that discussion a little later if you'd like. Satan claims that Job isn't such a great servant and that he only serves God because he is wealthy and things are always going his way. God gives Satan the right to test Job, saying, do anything to him, but don't take his life. And so in a very short time, Job's immense wealth disappears, his 7 sons and 3 daughters die, and Job himself is afflicted with a painful disease and now calls that into question. That's the background to start this with. And now, Diane, I turn it back to you. And I think I stayed within my 10 minutes.
I think you did extremely well. Thank you so much. And Bill Schulman will begin.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Diane, for asking me to participate in this panel discussion. It had been quite a few years since I had read the book of Job. I think it was back during the time when we had our Torah study with Rabbi Kunstadt at the Carpe Diem on the 2nd floor that I last read it. And when I was reading it this time, one of the things that struck me that I didn't remember about the book was that a lot of Job's lament uses courtroom and legal type imagery. And having been a federal judge for 20 years, I thought maybe that was something I could talk about to give you a little bit different perspective of the literary usage of court imagery. And to do that, I want to just briefly speak of the setting. So I'm actually going to be starting with the setting in chapter 3. Job starts off speaking and lamenting his birth and his very existence after learning, as the rabbi pointed out, about the death of his family members and virtually the loss of all of his personal property. The first of his 3 friends that speak is Eliphaz, and he suggests that Job lost everything because he was following the conventional wisdom of the time, and that was that only good people prosper, and obviously indirectly suggesting or accusing Job must have sinned to have brought this upon himself. Bildad, one of the other friends, speaks, and he insists that God can only act justly. And if somebody suffers, it's only because they must have sinned. Job, of course, considers himself a righteous man. He had gained a lot of wealth, had been very successful. And indeed, when he describes all his acts, he sounds and appears to be a righteous man. This raises a theme that I think one of the themes of the book of Job, which is, how can a man be righteous? For example, righteous among men, such as we would consider someone such as Noah? Or is this more in a forensic sense or a legal sense of being righteous? So this use of court imagery, I'm going to start in chapter 9 is where it really begins in earnest. And I'm just going to read a couple of passages. I'm not going to use too much of it, but I think I need to do that in order to bring out what I'm saying. Although I'm only reading a few passages, I want to emphasize that it is interspersed throughout most of the rest of the book of Job. And these are some of the best lines I thought that is characterized by what I wanted to talk about tonight. So with respect to court imagery, starting in chapter 9, verses 1 through 4, he says, "Indeed, I know that it is so. Man cannot win a suit against God. If he insisted on a trial with him, he would never answer one charge in 1,000. Wise of heart and mighty in power, whoever challenged him and came out whole?" Dropping down to verse 14. "How then can I answer him or choose my arguments against him? Though I were in the right, I could not speak out, but I would plead for mercy with my judge." Starting with line 19. If a trial of strength, he is the strong one. If a trial in court, who will summon him for me? Though I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, he would prove me crooked. And lastly, starting with verse 32, all in chapter 9, "He is not a man like me, how that I can answer him, that we can go to law together. No arbiter is between us to lay his hands on us both." So in this speech, particularly in that last one, God is essentially described both as a prosecutor and a judge. So how are you going to get a fair trial if the judge is also the prosecutor? Job feels that God has treated him unfairly, and Job would like to take him to court to plead his case. But he realizes that there's no point to doing so, because no case can possibly be adjudicated fairly, because Job believes that God is omnipotent and therefore controls everything. So this, of course, contradicts our modern view, or our view as modern Jews, I should say, of what is a just God. I mean, why would God cause all this just because he struck some kind of a test of Job with Satan? But the whole story of Job points to our idea of justice and trying to determine God's actions as whether they are just or not. Man really, as we've learned, certainly at the end of the book, that man cannot fathom this. The use of court imagery runs, as I said, throughout the book, and thus ties together the theme of justice, which I'm going to speak a little bit more about. In chapter 9, there is a particular line in line 12. It says, "Who can say to him, what are you doing?" I thought that was really interesting in doing some research. Who can say to him, i.e. God, what are you doing? Job is actually anticipating. The author actually uses the literary device of foreshadowing because it shows that Job is anticipating what he's going to end up being told by God at the end of the book. I mean, so it's hinting at what the ultimate answer that God is going to give him at the end of the book. And I thought that was rather interesting. In chapter 10, in lines 4 through 7, he says, and this is Job speaking, "Do you have the eyes of flesh? Is your vision that of mere men? Are your days the days of a mortal? Are your years the years of a man? That you seek my iniquity and search out my sin, you know that I am not guilty and that there is none to deliver to your hand." Job is really, by these words, he's accusing God and essentially demanding that God not act not like a man, flesh and blood, a mortal man, but to act more like a God. I should have prefaced at the beginning, I've been using, it's called the Jewish Study Bible, which if you don't have that book and you like reading Bible and having some insight, it's a wonderful book and has great footnotes, really good essays and things such as that. There was a footnote to that line that said that Job's sarcastic accusation here is among the most powerful in the book, demanding that God act like God and not like a human being. That struck me as something that I thought was not only interesting, but very important as well in understanding Job's plight. Other examples of Job using court or legal type imagery or analogy. Job says in chapter 27, he says, "He saved the poor man and the orphan. Justice was my cloak and turban. And I looked into the case of the stranger." This can actually, that line can actually be interpreted to mean that he not only helped the poor, but he helped them in their legal matters, or he looked into, or he investigated. The words actually written in this version is he looked into. That can be interpreted as being investigated their cases so that they could get either a fair hearing or a fair result. Just like a modern trial where you have an opening statement, then you put on the evidence, and then you have a final summation. Job has a summation in his last speeches toward the end of the book. In chapter 31, Job's confession of innocence and his final summation, he raises his defense to God and his friends, and he finally rests his case. In chapter 38, God, as we know, doesn't give him a straight answer to Job's demand for a hearing. The effect of God's speech is basically to put Job in his place. In chapter 42, line 7 and 8, it teaches us an equitable principle to judge others fairly. God basically rails against, this is toward the end, he rails against Job's friends for speaking so uncharitably and insists that they beg for Job's forgiveness and ask Job to pray for them. This teaches us not to blame people for their suffering, because to do so is malicious and increases the victim's suffering. I got this from reading a book called The Code of Jewish Ethics. It's by a rabbi, I think from Los Angeles, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. It's actually a very good book if you're interested in Jewish ethics. And I thought that I wanted to insert that in there because ethics is not just ethics, but from a legal standpoint, the whole idea is that everyone conducts themselves ethically. In closing, the idea is that Job struggles to find the relation, I think, between his own misfortune and his own morality. there's a book written by a Jesuit priest. His name is Father James Martin, and it's titled, it's a new book, as a matter of fact. It's titled Learning to Pray, a Guide for Everyone. And he said in an interview that I saw, he said that, and I thought that what his statement was, which was talking about his main theme in the book, is that he summed up the relevance of the whole book of Job to us as modern Jews today. When asked about the current suffering in the world with coronavirus, all the death and the misery and the economic suffering, Father Martin said this, and I'm quoting him: "The mystery of suffering really has no satisfactory answer. This is a God that we sometimes do not understand, but can we still be in a relationship with God that we don't fully understand? Prayer can serve as a vehicle for our own personal relationship with God." And my point is just as Job never forsaked his relationship with God, we can preserve our relationship with God even though we don't relate or we can't fathom everything that God has in store for us, bad things happening to what we consider good people. Prayer can serve as that vehicle to enable us to have our own personal relationship with God. And that's my 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you, Diane. And
We're having trouble hearing you,
can you hear me now?
not real well.
Let's see.
Can you turn your volume up?
On a different computer. It's all the way up.
Okay,
That
I'll
better?
turn my volume up.
Is that better? Let me see if I can.
Yeah.
Can y'all, I'll speak loudly. Can y'all hear me?
That's good.
Okay, I'll just lean in a little bit. Sorry about that. Thank you, Diane. I appreciate you asking me to do this. It's my first time on something like this, so we'll give it a shot. And it was interesting because the last time I really studied Job in depth was in college, and that was longer ago than I like to think. And it's funny, as Bill said, when you read it again, you see it from a different perspective with age. And as I read through it, I knew the basic story was bad things can happen to good people. But as I read through it, I was taken with the idea of all of the friends. And I know Bill referred to them, but we're first introduced to them in book 2, and it is, read it to you, around verse 11. It says, "Now when Job's 3 friends heard of this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place." And it's Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come and mourn with him and to comfort him. And it just kind of caught my attention because to me that so represents our Judaism. We come together to help each other. And the story goes on that they sat in solitude for 7 days, just comforting him, just being there for him, supporting him, being sad with him. Then Job begins to speak, and he is, at that point, after sitting and thinking, he's talking about how so much has happened to him and he's all upset. And that's when the friends turn around and start giving the advice Bill was referring to. And they spend quite a bit of time throughout the book. Each of them have their own reasons and thoughts that why they took it and it became about them as opposed to about Job. And finally, this goes on for a while, and then Job basically has enough. And in chapter 13, he says to the effect, let's see, he says, "But you're all forgers of lies, you're all physicians of no value." So he's telling his friends that they're nothing to him, that they're not there for him. And then we go on into chapter 16, and he says they are miserable comforters. I've heard of many such things, and you're all miserable comforters. So it kind of makes you think about how sometimes it's just most important to sit and be there for your friends as opposed to trying to give advice. That sometimes the best thing we can do is to sit back. And I think during this time of COVID, we kind of don't know how to be there for people. Sometimes we don't know how we can help them. We want to give advice, but sometimes the best thing to do is just to be there for each other and to comfort each other. And sometimes just the physical presence of those first 7 days were all that was needed.
Thank you. That struck me too, the 7 days without talking. I don't know if that's possible. And Ralph?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Diane, for putting this together and forcing all of us to actually read the Bible and not one particular book thereof. But let me say that without trying to be dismissive of this effort, Job struck me as
We're
really
having
just
trouble seeing you.
hearing me or seeing me.
Seeing you.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. Job struck me as more philosophic nonsense than anything else, and maybe a waste of time in the modern sense.
Ooh.
You know, I see the paradigm for our people more like Jacob struggling with himself and with God, and his name being changed to Israel, than I do this study of how to understand the nature and intent of the divine. Because, and I say that I consider it kind of preposterous and a waste, because it can't be done. That there's suffering without regard to sin is apparent, particularly to Jewish people. We know that from the experience of Europe and the experience of innocent people like children. And we know that even from yesterday from what happened in Colorado. We're not going to be able to know the nature of God, and we're not going to be able to know his characteristics and what his intent is in any given moment. And it's a kind of philosophic waste of time to dwell too long on that. So I think the ancients realized that, and I think the book of Job has that as its central lesson. There's a word for that. It's called theodicy, which has to do with trying to understand the nature of God. And the Jewish people are not the first to creep with that. The Greeks worried about that too. But it's not knowable, and there's no answer really to suffering. And the book of Job kind of demonstrates that. But what we do have an answer to is what's required of us and what we can do together as a caring, educated people, familiar with science and not expressing, hopefully, what I would call excessive faith. Without action, prayer is a wonderful thing, particularly for the person who's praying, but without action, not much good can happen in the world in terms of human affairs. So we're not to know the mind of God or his nature, but we know what's required of us, and that was made a reference to in Micah, and only to love mercy and do justice and walk humbly, and the rest of it is commentary on how all of that gets done. But Job is a pre-scientific, pre-empirical study or story that's really not very helpful. It has wonderful poetry in it. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I told the ocean how far it should extend? And other poetic lines. But some of the nature of God we have to surrender to that. We have to surrender and accept philosophically. The answer to suffering if there is any answer, and to the improvement of the human condition is the realization of human interdependence and the value of cooperation, and also to some extent solidarity. Things that we do together can be very powerful. But spending a lot of time reflecting on how God can allow suffering and what his nature is not a very useful enterprise. Better you should write a check and send it to a charity, or give some thought to what we can really be doing about the world in repairing it and making it better. And not worrying too much about what God and what divine intervention there may be and what God may do or not do, or why he does what he does. That's not a knowable thing. Since it's not knowable, it's not something to spend a lot of time trying to know. And that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, all of you. I appreciate you taking the time to give this presentation. And I really want to open it up to everyone for further discussion. But first, I want to tell you that the reason I wanted this production to take place is I've been stuck in my home trying to keep motivated doing something. I've been watching a lot of different presentations on Zoom. And one of the ones that I really enjoyed a lot was the Theater of War. And they presented the book of Job. Actually, Bill Murray was the actor who was Job. And as interesting as the presentation was, I thought it would be even more interesting to have three smart friends and our rabbi give views about the book, and then follow it with, since we haven't been able to be with one another and engage in conversation, I'd hope that the last part until 6:30 would be all of us participating. Anything that you want to say, I would like for you, unmute now, and please raise your hand or use the hand that's provided by Zoom. And Michael's going to help me recognize people, and let's get started. No questions? Nothing to add?
Why don't we
Richard
start?
Frank,
Go ahead.
Yes.
I wanted to try that instead of raising my hand because I just
Okay.
like to be a little contrary. Ralph, if if it's not really worth considering, which is kind of the way that I interpreted what you said. I mean, you don't like it, and I very much appreciate the reference to Micah. But I think it's altogether what the three of you said is very much worth considering, and the rabbi, in that there are lessons here. You all talk about, I would ask the question, is there a value in not being able to know God? We in our branch of the religion have talked a lot lately over the last several years about I can't get the word right, but we don't call a God he or she anymore, because that makes God too much of a person, which God is not. And so I think it has a great value to consider what is God. And the book does that. I mean, it's, from many different viewpoints. And so I appreciate it. And I was trying to be a little bit of a filler here and get somebody else to ask some questions, because it makes my life better.
Can I try to respond to him?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying that the book is not worth considering, but it's not worth considering very long. It's one of those things that you consider in passing. But Jewish people have been have a plural sense, not a singular sense. And unless we act communally and together, uh, things won't be repaired, things won't be better. We can't stand by and wait. There's no end to the reading of Torah and Talmud. At some point, you have to take action, and most action has to be done in a communal or at least a plural sense. And we speak of the first person plural when we speak of we and not I. So I'm not saying the book doesn't, the theodicy is not worth considering, but it's not worth considering very long. It's a distraction. And if you take too much time with it, it's like if all you did was pray and look for serenity, you wouldn't do anything about the world. You know, all of this study can't have its meaning only to enhance your intellectual ability without some action for the benefit of yourself, your family, your community, the larger community. There has to be some purpose. And to that extent, the story of Job is kind of distracts from that. That's my opinion of it. I don't think it's almost, you're not going to know the nature and character of God. You have to move along and take what action you can. Tikkun olam, as they say.
Well, I was disappointed in the friends. I thought that they should have stayed by Job's side and not start judging him because he was having a difficult time. And the next, one of the theaters of war that I saw was about Hercules. And he came home after all of his feats and found someone who had taken over his household. He went into a rage, killed everyone. And ultimately in his rage, he killed his wife and his children. And when he woke up and realized what he did, his friend was there and he said, you were there for me. I will be there for you. I will be by your side and I will help you. I will not leave you, which is totally different than we saw with Job's friends who started judging him.
But the whole thing with the friends, the whole story is a construct to illustrate that we're not going to know the unknowable. And everybody goes through this. So go through it, get through with it, and move on to the next thing. That's the value of the book. I don't think it's Jeremiah or Isaiah or the Ten Commandments. I think it's a minor work that's included because it's a very human thing to worry about.
So did you see something different in the book that was surprising to you? You know, it's interesting to read the same thing at different stages of your life, and different elements mean different things to you during different stages.
Well, what I love about what I like about the book is the poetry that's included in it, the figures that are included in it. And I thought Carol's point about the value of friendship is relatable, extremely relatable. And her ending point that sometimes in life, what we do is all we can do is be present. We don't have to say anything because sometimes there's nothing that we can say. What are we going to say to those 10 people we just lost in Colorado, or the officer that's lost? It's unbearable.
The officer with 7 children.
What do we say to them?
There's nothing to say.
Well, we have a Congress, we have a community, and maybe we can do something about things that'll make things better, and maybe something like that won't happen again. But we can't just stand by and be prayerful forever. At some point, we're duty bound. Few are guilty, but all are responsible.
Ralph, I agree with so much of what you're saying. That may surprise you. But I would couch things in one perspective. First, that as we move through in a chronological fashion, we the rabbis have struggled with the validity and the value of the book of Job. There's no question about it. That's why I mentioned it was, some considered it fiction, some considered it fact. And I'm talking about early Talmudic rabbis who took that perspective, not necessarily just current ones. Part of the value, I think, of the book of Job is what we're doing right now. It initiates a conversation. Why do we have a conversation about God? And that's an interesting thing to think about for a second. I believe we have a conversation about God because if we are taking on a perspective that we are God's hands in this world, God's not going to necessarily, unless we get a miracle happen, we don't count on those miracles happening. We have to make those kinds of things happen, as you said. You can pray, but unless you do something, it's of little value to the world. So the question now comes in, well, what is the perspective of God? Who are you praying to and why? Or are you just doing good deeds? And the perspective of challenging what God is all about gives you an opportunity to challenge and to evaluate your own worth vis-a-vis something to put against your idea, your image of yourself. One of the things that's interesting that the early rabbis actually took this challenge, and one of the things that they said was that when the Israelites went into Babylonian captivity, God went with them. Not only did they bring the tradition, but they brought it in the sense that God was with them, and while they were on the shores of the sea, of the river of Babylon, crying, God was crying with them. That's a very contemporary perspective. We don't get that very often until more recently. And so I think that is where I would respond to what you're saying.
Thank you. I've spoken too much. If somebody else have an idea.
I have a comment.
That's hard.
Hello?
Who's speaking?
Harvey,
What?
Harvey.
Yeah,
how you get, how would he tap that?
You raise you wave your hand.
hello?
Harvey?
Yeah.
You want to make a
My,
comment?
my comment on this whole thing is kind of where Ralph was going with it. It bothers me about the book of Job that God is complicit in letting all this happen and encouraging it, more or less, to happen to Job. I find that disturbing. That's an impression that someone would be left with about God. I think we all agree that there's evil in the world, and we've seen a lot of it. And more or less what Ralph said, as a community and a people, we have to keep on trying to improve the world and doing our part to hopefully make it a better place, and do the Tacombe alum and work in that direction. I think that's our the direction that the Jewish people are supposed to be going in. The world's not perfect, and we're aware of that. And the book of Job just seems to make it seem like it's going to be a harder job to correct things when God is more or less letting these things happen, which is very disturbing.
It's interesting that you made that point, Harvey, because I was listening to a scholar that it wasn't a Jewish point of view, but some
Try way big.
think of God in
Yes,
this
Tom.
as bully, which
Just
is
like-
sort of shocking to me to use that terminology, but it sort of fits into what you were saying.
I just don't know whether that.
May I say something?
Well,
This is
Ann-
Mark. This is Mark. May I say something?
Can Ann go next and then you?
Sure.
Do you mind,
No.
Ann?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that that
I don't know how
prayer
to-
is wonderful, and I
Oh,
agree.
but
Prayer is
There's
is important too, but I think action and trying to do something to make the world better is ultimately the most powerful thing probably that we can do. But I do think it's worthwhile, that the book of Job is worthwhile. The idea in there of how can bad things, you know, why do bad things happen to good people? Supposedly, you know, if you're good, then, you know, there's even references in the Bible to this about, you know, if you live a good life, that you know, you'll get some kind of reward, and if you don't, something awful will happen to you. But even though we may have a more modern view of all this, there are many people in our own contemporary society, Jews and others, who still when they experience some kind of misfortune, and all of us at some point experience some kind of sadness in our life. Everyone does. That when they experience that, if it's something that strikes them hard enough, they will say to themselves, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my child? Or why did this happen to these persons or those persons, and these who are to their thinking good people? And all of that, the whole why rests, I think, on our concept of God. And God a God who is going to reward the righteous and punish the guilty, right? And so, and also the idea of an omnipotent God. And Harold Kushner, that rabbi that wrote the book, you know, why do bad things happen to good people? I don't know how many of you may have read that. Had a lot of interesting things to say about that. But I think that conversation is still something that is important in our day and age, because I know people who have been affected by some tragedy in their life that have a difficult time forgiving God, really, is what it is. That is, and I think that's why the conversation about all of that is important.
It's an interesting point of view. Thank you. And Mark?
There are very few of our matriarchs and patriarchs who question God. Abraham did. If you can find X number of people, don't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And they couldn't even find 10. Moses, on a couple of occasions, when the scouts came back, and 10 of them said, we can't reach the promised land. God wanted to destroy the Israelites, and Moses pleaded on their behalf. I think that if I remember from reading Job a few years ago, not only did he question God, but as Bill said, he wanted a trial. I think the important thing of reading this one of the 39 books in the Tanakh is that Job never lost faith in God. He never cursed God, as his three friends in some cases asked him to do. And guess what? It had a happy ending. He remarried, he became prosperous, and we never found out why God initially asked Satan to do this. And we never got an answer, I don't think, as to why someone as righteous as this had to go through such pain and suffering, which is a question that generally was not raised, well, I guess it was raised with slavery and other things. The end.
Mark, I always thought it was interesting with Abraham that he argued with God. He wanted to find righteous men and to save some people in Sodom and Gomorrah. But when Sarah said, get rid of Hagar, she was gone. Would anybody else like to add something?
He didn't argue when God told him to sacrifice Isaac. He did what he said he was supposed to do.
That's an interesting story too that we ought to discuss sometime.
It is.
Are we
Every Rosh
supposed to,
Hashanah.
is this supposed to come down to? Huh? Hello? Okay, is this supposed to come down to, we believe that what it says there is in the beginning of the book, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Praise be the Lord. And is that the end of it? Or?
I'll jump in. It seems to have it frozen. I'm trying not to dominate, but I don't know if this answer will necessarily help you, but I want to give a response that I think Ann already mentioned, Rabbi Harold Kushner, when bad things happen to good people, and his concept of you're asking the wrong question. The question really is one in which we say about God that perhaps God is limited or God intentionally limits his knowledge, God's knowledge or omnipotence or whatever, and things happen. I'm not sure I totally am comfortable with that. I like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's response as far as, and that he has some incredible books about God, no question about that. But this one, I actually heard him at Temple Emmanuel in Dallas at the end of a presentation, and someone said to him, Rabbi Heschel, where was God during the Holocaust? And the question, of course, it comes up many times, the question of God and did God cause the Holocaust? If God is, why wouldn't God stop the Holocaust? All of that. And his response was a woman had asked the question and he answered with, madam, my dear madam, the question is not where was God, but where was man? And I think that follows in very much along the line of what Ralph was trying to say as well, as far as the God and where we come with it.
Thank you very much. I had told everybody that this would be over at 6:30 at 6:30. So thank you so much for attending. I appreciate it. If you have any comments, please send them to us. Also, if you have any ideas that you would like for us to have a program about, we would appreciate your letting us know. I thought it would be interesting to have a panel talk about CRISPR, genetic coding, from a religious and from a scientific point of view. So maybe we'll pursue that in the future. With that,
Diane,
thank you so
Diane,
very much. Yes.
Diane, this is Bill. Can I
Yes.
just say, I wanted to join you. First of all, thank you again. I thought all the comments were really good. And everybody really did a nice job. And, hopefully we'll have more of these and they'll be just as good and, help encourage people to read, because no matter what, whether you think the book doesn't have its value or not, I mean, you still get such great gleanings from this. I mean, I never would have thought about this stuff before and in my previous readings. And we may not get an answer to all of our questions, but you still think, it makes you think about God, it makes you think about your relationship with God. It makes you think, in my case, it made me think about justice in the format of, what is the right thing to do? I pulled out an ethical teaching, a Jewish ethical teaching, and even gleaned something from a Jesuit priest. But I mean, it's all relative. and it's all worthwhile. And thank you for that.
Diane, before we go, I want to thank you. This was your brainchild. This was all you. It was a wonderful presentation. I want to thank all of the participants. And I thought it was so interesting that I want to echo what you said, which is if any of you have ideas for an interesting interactive program like this, please let me or Diane or Gil know so we can do this again. So thank you, Bill, Carol, my father, Rabbi, and especially Diane. This was a wonderful thing.